Welcome to Nice Ashes. I'm Nate.
And I'm Mike. What are we smoking today, Nate?
We are following up the Flor de Oliva Maduro with the Flor de Oliva Gold.
Gold!
Gold! I like gold. This one is a lot lighter than the Maduro, as one would expect by the name.
Yes, this is definitely a Connecticut. I am not expecting anything. I'm not going in with expectations.
Yeah, I mean, like the Maduro was good, I think. Fine, pretty good. Better than fine.
Yeah, it was better than...
This isn't a brand I know of, so...
No. This is a new one for me. It's very budget-friendly. So it could go either way.
It could. I think there's a slight hint of spice on the cap. I might be mistaken.
It might be the smell. There is a spicy smell to it.
It could be. First few puffs are fine. Nothing offensive. It's got kind of that... I don't know what you would call it, the Connecticut kind of like body taste, the nutty, kind of the nuttiness. I think that's kind of a trend with the Connecticut's. They're a little nuttier in flavor profile, Mike. Is that? Some of them anyway.
Some of them anyway. I would tend to agree with that. I had some lighting issues, not with the cigar.
I heard.
Yeah. You heard, they won't.
They likely won't. Yeah, I always try and make sure my lighter is full of lighter fluid before we come out to record.
Well, I'm trying to light matches. I'm trying to burn up I have two boxes of cigar matches. And of course, the reason why I'm trying to burn them up is because the box won't light the match anymore. So now I'm using like old crappy Bic lighters to light a match.
You can't just go get yourself a little strip of sandpaper or something, Mike?
No, I don't have sandpaper here. Why would I have sandpaper?
What? Oh, you're an electrician. That's right. You don't use sandpaper.
Yeah, that's what you do work with. Ick.
Yeah. Your lineman pliers doesn't have a match lighter on it.
Right. Yeah. Next time that Nipix makes a new lineman design, that's what they should do.
Tell them it needs a match light strip.
Yeah, it's pretty standard start to a Connecticut. A little airy, not too bad, a little nutty, but maybe a little astringent. I don't know.
Yeah, possibly. It's like I said, it's not offensive, but we'll see how the flavors play out.
Okay, so we're going to talk about something that Nate and I really struggled with.
This is a book review first and foremost, but to get to the book review, we have to get through some other stuff first.
Yes, and we're reviewing a book called Sparked.
The subtitle is George Floyd, Racism, and the Progressive Illusion.
Yes. And it's all essays by elites who are typically not from Minnesota.
Well, let's get
time here.
Yeah, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Mike. This is so the back of the book here says 36 social scientists, professors, and other academics reflect on the meaning of race and racism in Minnesota. Yada yada yada, right? And this is published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. And they have a publishing wing at the Minnesota Historical Society, Minnesota History Museum. And this is one that I saw sitting on the shelf there because we took a family trip there. And I took a picture and sent it to Mike. And your response was, we should do that for the show. And lo and behold, here we fucking are. But like Mike said, this is written by people that either live in Minnesota, have lived in Minnesota, or came to Minnesota and live here or used to live here. We're going to get into kind of like their backgrounds a little bit. I took a slew of notes. Mike took a slew of notes. The book, the actual reading bit, right, because they have suggested reading at the end. But the book is, for everyone to get kind of a sense of this, it is 217 pages long. In its paperback edition. I don't think there's another edition. It has 36 essays plus like an introduction and an afterword type of thing. This took me, I checked, this took me 4 months to read. Yes. June, the Butlerian Jihad, which I struggled with massively, took me 5 months to read, and that's a 700-page book. So if you just want to know initially what my thoughts are on this, that's the timing it took. But before we get into the book, I'm sure most people are aware of George Floyd and the stuff that happened, but I wanted to kind of talk through that a little bit before we get into the book.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because the George Floyd thing is still a point of contention in the upper Midwest here. Like, you can get into a legit argument with almost anybody. Here, it's like a taboo almost subject now to talk about in any kind of circle. because it's as divisive as, let's say, the upcoming election or religion or football teams. Not to try and like take important topics and relegate them down to the level of football, but some people really take football too seriously and get really worked up about it.
Oh, yes. And it's both, for whatever reason, there's teams around pro George Floyd and pro police. And realistically, for anybody who's seen the video, the police were clearly in the wrong, right? This established this, my perspective at least. George Floyd was under arrest for allegedly passing along a fake $20 bill. Now, he was a bouncer at a bar, so even if he did pass along a 20, there's no evidence to show that he personally did anything illegal. He could have gotten that at his workplace and not have known himself. Potentially. We don't know.
Potentially. I think there's a couple other things, because I can hear other people. I can hear them, even if they're not listening to the podcast. I can hear them saying, "Well, there was fentanyl and meth found in George Floyd's system. That's why he died." One of the autopsies showed that it was a drug overdose that killed him, and not the lack of oxygen. And I did a little bit of research on the side, and I'm not an autopser. What? I'm not a medical professional. I don't know. I'm not somebody who can determine cause of death. What I found or what I learned or discovered on the internet, so it must be true, is that there are a variety of police holds to detain a person. Some of those holds, like the one used on George Floyd, have a consequence of restricting airflow to the lungs. And there are people that will fight you on the video evidence and say he wasn't kneeling on the neck but the upper shoulder, whatever. Regardless, the hold is not a hold that is taught in a lot of police departments nowadays. I don't know. I don't know what the Minneapolis Police Department, Precinct 3, what their training program was. It's a hold that nobody should be in for 9 minutes or 8 minutes or whatever. And people will say, well, George Floyd was a criminal. He had a counterfeit $20 bill. He was high on drugs. And I would say, even if those things are true, we have a legal system in this country so that you can be high on drugs with counterfeit money and not be executed or murdered or killed by the police. Like, that's not the police's job.
I agree.
If you're speeding on the highway, should the police kill you because you're breaking the law? Speeding. We're talking even 1 mile over the speed limit. There's no difference. I mean, there's a difference, but if we're going like, you want to go strict black and white on this, 1 mile over the speed limit is breaking the law. The same as George Floyd potentially was breaking the law.
Now, I will say that when people bring up George Floyd's criminal past, that's a tactic called poisoning the well. So yes. Whenever that tactic is used in a conversation about this topic, I poison the well as well. So Derek Chauvin was involved with 17 incidents where he was investigated for abusing perpetrators. Also, he is in prison for embezzling money, right? He had just shy of $500,000 in unclaimed income. Now, there's only so many ways a police officer can magically get $500,000 that he didn't claim on his taxes, right? And none of them are good, right? So he was clearly involved in criminal activity.
Do some of those ways involve counterfeit 20s?
I'm going to guess so. I know that his ex-wife got convicted as well.
Yeah, I mean, that evidence locker sure is tempting.
Right. All I'm saying is that clearly he was involved with illegal activity as well. And he was a dirty cop, and he should not have been on the police force. Independent of this.
Yes, independent of this. I just wanted to say that even if George Floyd was breaking the law, which the police don't decide, the police say, we believe you to be breaking the law, and then there's a court case later to determine if that was in fact true or not, is how it should work.
I agree.
And they kept him in this hold that is known to restrict the airways of even healthy people for, 9 minutes. So the unbiased stuff that I saw on the internet was, if George Floyd did have drugs in his system, it would have made that hold more dangerous. as was evidenced, I guess. Not saying that's proof that he had drugs in his system, but just, if you have even medications can make breathing more difficult. So it's a dangerous hold that's really intended to subdue the person until you get handcuffs on them, and then they're supposed to be rolled onto their back so they can breathe. And that didn't happen in this case. And a lot of people say, well, he was a criminal, so he deserves to die. And again, that's one of those things where we have the legal system so that the courts can decide who dies and who doesn't die. And there can be appeals and there can be evidence, actual evidence, and not just the feelings in the moment. So that's the only reason I brought up like the speeding stuff, right? Okay, if we're going to say he's a criminal, then anyone who's gone a mile over on the speed limit is also a criminal, just to be clear.
Right.
Not trying to defend any party, but let's just get it out there because it is a sensitive topic.
Well, let's have some perspective, right? Do we want the police to be Judge Dredd? Or
no, I don't.
Do we want the police to be Barney Fife? Like, between those two extremes, I'm picking Barney Fife every single time.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. They're supposed to work for the people, I guess, right? They're a government agency.
We can get into that later or now, but before this, I was a big proponent of community policing. So a lot of these urban areas, Minneapolis especially, so the police are not from the community that they are officers in. Yeah. Whereas in more rural areas, even in medium-sized cities, the police live where they are officers. There's no way for them not to be because of where they live. So your small town cop might beat some people up and do some crazy stuff, probably not going to egregiously kill someone on the side of the street because he's policing his neighbors, he or she, whoever they are. They're going to be less aggressive towards people who they know are their neighbors, who they know have relatives who are their neighbors. There's no way to escape knowing who this person is through the grapevine somehow.
Well, and there's a really good movie about this, Mike. It's called First Blood, where the police officer doesn't know Sylvester Stallone, Rambo, and keeps antagonizing him until stuff happens. So
very true.
It's unfortunately, it's a common trope that happens in real life and film and media that goes back. I mean, there's not a song out there that says "fuck the fire department."
Right.
So
agreed.
Unfortunately, the police departments, while they do good things and are necessary a lot of times or in certain circumstances, maybe not a lot of times, statistically speaking, but they do tend to overstep their bounds or attract the kind of people that like to overstep bounds and not be confined by rules, let's say.
We're going to get into stats later, I promise.
Yeah, we'll get into stats. Let's get into this book. I mean, the first thing I wrote was in my notes was this book has 36 essays in it. It's 200 pages long. The essay requirements have changed since I was in school, man. Like, I don't know how to say that. It's they're like 2-page essays. Fuck. I would have graduated when I was like 12 if all the essays I had to write were 2 pages.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's like, I don't know why this wasn't called a series of 36 op-ed pieces. Like, that's more truthful.
They basically are. So, yeah, in the preface, which I read, obviously, they mentioned that everybody who's writing in the book is an elite, a.k.a. a college professor. All of them are BIPOC and mostly black. Some are African-American, some are not. But
some are Native American.
There's indigenous people, and there's among a person or two, there's a South Korean, but they're all BIPOC. Now, this is the first thing I found egregious and a lie. In the preface, they made the claim that white supremacists are emboldened and that police killings of minorities have increased. So, of course, I went and looked at the stats, right?
Yeah.
So, overall, from 17 to 22, police killings in the United States went from 981 to 1,097. Now, from 17 to 22, let's see here, 22. Killings of black people went from 222 to 225. Killings of Hispanics went from 180 to 120. Killings of now I can't remember what O was, went from 44 to 22. White people went from 458 to 225. And undetermined went from 77 to 341. So,
well, you know what that tells me, Mike?
What's that tell you, Nate?
That tells me that they still be shooting the black people, but they're calling them undetermined.
What that tells me is that they're killing a lot more homeless people And because they're homeless, they don't have to declare what race they are.
Well, that could be true, too.
That's what I'm going to guess.
I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of ways to cook the numbers, right?
There's ways to cook the numbers. But to say that it's increased is a misinformation at best.
Well,
right?
the killings of blacks did increase, not by a large amount, but it did increase. But the killings of Hispanics went down.
Yes.
So,
and of other people who were identified as minorities, in half, which is like indigenous, I'm guessing, and Asian people.
Yes.
So I looked up some additional stats because we're talking about violence by the police, right, and killings by the police. So I looked it up. Rural shootings are 30% lower than urban shootings by population. Amongst rural shootings, 66% are white, 10% are black. Of the rural shootings, 1/3 begin when the police officers are being shot at. Now, the reason why I say rural is because there are no stats for urban areas. I wonder why.
Okay.
It's questionable to me why.
It's too many numbers, Mike. It's too many numbers.
Right. Yeah, it's too many numbers. But if
the police only have 10 digits, 20 if you count their toes to count out.
Yeah.
So they
if
can't figure it out.
Of people who are shot by the police in rural areas are gunfights started by the perpetrator, then I have to imagine that it's pretty similar, right? It has to be. You would think. So,
yeah, I've said something similar to my wife about drivers, right? She says, oh, there's so many dumb drivers down here in the cities. And I said, well, there's probably the same, percentage of dumb drivers here as there is anywhere else, but there's just more people here, so you encounter more of them. But the stat isn't really different.
Right. So I went further. I dived deeper.
Yeah.
Very few states keep track of this, but Connecticut is one that does. Now, in Connecticut, in 2022, there's 3.6 million people that live there, and they had just over 300,000 police interactions. So officially recognized police stops. So that's 10% of the population, let's say. You can say that. So we'll just double it for good measure. And we'll say that 20% of the population gets stopped by the police in a year. In the United States, that would mean about 67 million police interactions occur. Okay? And that's doubling the rate in Connecticut. So given that rate of police stoppage and the known number of people that died, there is a 0.00001736 chance of being shot by a police officer at any given time during a police interaction.
Is that any race or...
Any race. They're not keeping track of the race, right? Because majority of police stops are traffic violations. So we're just talking police stops, right? Because we're talking all police stops. We're in this world where any police stop can turn violent, which it can. So we're going to count them all. So if you or I or any random person were to be stopped, you have a 0.000173 chance of being shot. Now, it's actually lower than that because 1/3 of the shootings occur when you shoot at the police first, right?
Which should not be a surprise.
Right? So that 0.00001736 is actually 1/3 of that, right? Because you or 2/3 of that, because you can take 1/3 of that away because you're not shooting at the police. So it's actually 0.00009%, right? That's a lot of zeros in front of that, behind that decimal point. Like it is, I would bet money on that, right? I would bet money that you're not going to be shot by the police, killed by the police. So, again, this whole topic is about police violence and white supremacy and how the police state and all that. And the odds are really low.
The odds are low. The odds should be as close to zero as possible, of course.
Absolutely.
But I want to say, I guess, for the book, because it's 36 different essays, I'm just going to use essays because that's what the book uses. I've already spoke my piece, and I don't think it should be essays, so I'm not going to rehash that. 36 different voices in here. Some of them talk about police, some of them don't talk about police, some of them just talk about being in Minnesota, and then you have like the forward and the afterword by the editors who try and kind of tie it all together. But one of my main kind of criticisms of this book is there's 36 different authors that only have a few pages or have only written a few pages. So you don't really get a chance to learn the author's voice or ground what they're saying in anything, because it's just kind of, it's almost like beat poetry, where it's just kind of like what they're feeling at the moment that they're sitting down to write. I don't know that any of these people, and I don't know that, you know, if you're one of the authors in this book, you can at me or whatever. I don't know that they sat down to go back and revise what they wrote, or, you know, think about it, or try and like make it concise, or make an actual like true honest to goodness point. I also need to say that both Mike and I are white, and this book is very clearly not written for white people, which is fine. It doesn't have to be. But I think I'm halfway through the cigar, Mike. Where are you at with yours?
I'm about the same, I would say.
Okay. So far, it's been pretty decent. I don't really have anything negative to say. I don't really have anything super positive to say, other than it's there, you know. It's
bland and a little airy. It's kind of what I expected it to be in the back of my mind, having smoked the Maduro. It is not offensive. It's not bad.
Offensive. Yeah, it's not bad. It's not great.
It's fine.
It's just in there. Should we try and get through some of these essays?
Yes, we should.
I think, and we've been debating, Mike and I have been debating if this is going to be a 2-episode book, despite it only being 200 pages long, but there's an awful lot to unpack in this book. So we'll see how it goes. I took notes on probably 75, 80% of the things, and then I got to a point where I was like, I just can't anymore. I need to finish this book and be done with it. And not really because, I don't know, I didn't feel like it was harassing me necessarily. I didn't feel uncomfortable with a lot of the stuff that was presented in terms of like white guilt or any of that stuff. There's other things we'll get into later on about the book, and like maybe our final thoughts on the book is a better place to get into it. But
yes. So
go on, Mike.
Let's get into it, because we will discuss these as we go. I took a lot of notes. So
yeah, I tried to take a little bit of notes on each, but I knew there was 36 of them because they kept saying like, hey, there's 36 people here. And so I tried to take a little bit of notes just so I'd remember what each essay was about. And of course, it's been 4 months since I started this thing, so I'm glad that I did.
Yes. So the first essay was called Coloring the Progressive Illusion. Now, I'm going to say my piece here. This essay is the perfect one to begin with because it uses very heavily coded language, right? So it uses the term diverse as code for not being white. Doesn't mean diversity, it means not white. And it also uses the term black folks, which is a coded term used by elites. Anytime you hear the word folks, that is code. They're talking to each other, right? Because you can't call them people, because their people include corporations, right? So this is a very coded essay. I will also say that they brought up a stat that in the mid-70s, 98.2% of the Minnesota population was white. And this is important. And I went and looked, and right now, in 2020 census, 92% of the over 65 population in Minnesota is white. So you have to remember that all these stats they're going to bring up, the backdrop is that a generation ago, 99% plus were either white or indigenous, right? The Hispanic and black and Asian population combined 50 years ago was less than 1%. Right? So everybody, not everybody, but the vast majority of minorities that are in Minnesota have moved here in the last 50 years. And that's a good backdrop to keep in mind, because they're going to talk about the education disparities, which they brought up in this essay. And there are some pretty dramatic education disparities, right? Now, they didn't talk about the urban-rural divide, because in Minnesota, there's an urban-rural divide in education. And that plays a huge part, because the majority of minorities live in urban areas where they have lower educational outcomes across the board.
Yeah. And if you're not a 4chaner like Mike, my notes don't have coded messages largely. I'm teasing you, Mike. But I did write down, because this first essay mentioned like a white Wakanda. So I just wrote down like white Wakanda with a question mark. Like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Like, Wakanda is like a Marvel thing and like a utopia for black people in the Marvel universe. Like, if these people are to be believed, the white Wakanda should just be called America, right? Like, it doesn't have to be called white Wakanda. You just call it America. Right. Like, if it's as bad as you're saying it is. And they talked about like home ownership, but they lived in the Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul. I put that this author used a lot of stats with a lot of implied causation, right? So they were spouting out all these stats, like all of this stuff was due to white racism or something like that. But none of the stats, if you look at them from a mathematical view, like correlation doesn't mean causation. We all know that.
Well, the correlation is wrong because they repeatedly say 79% of the home ownership in Minnesota is white. But if in 1975, 98.2% of the population was white, and currently 92% of the population over 65 is white, well then of course 79% of home ownership is going to be white. All the people who have been here long enough to gain the assets to buy a home are white. You don't move someplace and then just magically get success.
Yeah. If you have what is it, Mike? Like over 90% is white, so you've got 8% not white. 90% of the, let's just say 90% of the homeowners are white.
It's 79%.
79. Sorry.
Yes.
So let's just call it 80 because easy numbers, right? This is Easy Numbers, the show. You can thank your teacher and lambast mine. 80% of the home ownership is white, but 90, let's just call it 90. We'll just go round numbers. 80% of home ownership is white. 90% of the population is white. That means that 20% of the home ownership is non-white of the 10% of the population that's non-white. So that's a stellar number for diverse people. Right, you've got a population of 90% of white people, and only 80% of home ownerships are white people. But you've got a population of 90% white people. So you're telling me that there's a greater percentage of non-white people that own homes than there is of white people that own homes. Like, I'm reading that right? Like,
no,
that's what the stat
92% of the population over 65 is white.
Over 65.
Yeah, but the majority of homeowners are going to be a part of the group that was here. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, but that's what I'm saying is like these stats are confusing, and if you can't back them up
without having the background of understanding.
Yeah, which you can't get in a 2-page essay.
Yeah, the year my parents graduated high school, 99.5% of the population was a tribal member or white, right? That is a fact. So, of course, you're going to have disparities between the minorities who have moved here in recent times, mostly looking for work, right? And then the population that lived here and owned everything before they showed up, right? Everything was private property before 1975. So everything that, of course, you're going to have the racial disparity. That's the nature of private property, right?
Yeah. The other thing I said about this essay was that the author liked to lump all non-whites together when convenient, but then they focused on only the blacks at all other times. So when they wanted to make those grandiose statistical statements, it was non-whites. But when they were trying to pull at the emotional heartstrings, it was blacks.
Oh, yes. So we're going to change. This is the same essay.
Yeah.
The author mentioned that minorities had 5 times worse outcomes from COVID. They died at a 5 times higher rate. But that was largely due, and I looked at the stats and I didn't write it down. Minorities in Minnesota don't have the same rate of health insurance. They have lower rates of access to health care, of course. And the author tried to insinuate that was white supremacy, but how is it the white population's fault that the minority population doesn't have health insurance? I did not choose the careers that those people chose. They could have chosen to do anything they wanted to do.
Well, what about MN care?
Well, MN covers anybody making less than used to be $24,000 a year and $48,000 as a family of 4. So MNCare covers a lot of people, which is good. Like, I want it to cover more people, not less.
I guess, like, the question is, do they not have health insurance because they don't have access to it, or do they have access to it but they weren't told about it, or like what's the underlying reason why they're not using it?
Right. And
if it's
who
there,
knows? Yeah,
which could be white supremacy, because I've seen things where primarily black schools don't teach sex ed, and they don't teach a lot of things that more white population schools teach. So
is that because of racism, or is that because of the parents' choices and their demands on their local school?
Well, I don't know.
I don't know
either. I didn't do a study on that. I'm playing devil's advocate saying like, yeah, and it's the same thing as with this author is, yeah, you can pull stats out of anywhere, but if you don't know the reason behind it, it doesn't really mean anything. If you say, oh, well, hey, this author's wrong because guess what? Blacks don't have the same access to healthcare as whites. Well, isn't that just kind of proving the author's point?
Right.
Unless we know why they're not using the min care. Or why they're not on something. Yeah, I'm not. We're not trying to get into a fight here. I'm just trying to say, like, a lot of these things are very, very sticky and tricky.
Very sticky
to kind of like figure out.
Yeah, and this person. So this is the end of my notes for this particular essay.
Sure. Yeah.
And they brought up an example, and this example can pretty much sum up this whole book. This person told the story of two parents that she knew. One was a Latino, and this Latino mother wanted her child to stay in the inner city. She didn't want to move to the suburbs because she wanted her child to grow up around other minorities. And this was considered good and multicultural. She knew a white couple or a white parent who wanted their child to go to a diverse school because they wanted their child to get exposed to minorities so that it would help their future career and being able to get along with everybody.
Yep.
And that white person was called racist for that reasoning.
Yep.
So there's nothing you can do that isn't racist if you're white.
Well, that is the point of the book, Mike. It's damned if you do, damned if you don't, if you're white.
More or less.
Which we'll get into more. And again, this is coming from two white men.
It is.
All right, so the next one is called Blackasotin, Identity Lanes, which makes you think of bowling, but it had nothing to do with bowling, so I was a little bit disappointed. But I did write down that it was kind of like a mostly positive view of Minnesota, but they talked about the disparity between white and black incomes and home ownership, and then they kind of encouraged blacks to find their resistance lands, which would be protesting, organizing, surviving the day. So I guess, kind of a call to find what works for you to resist racism.
Right.
I don't know. I didn't feel like there was anything really overtly terrible in this one.
So I made my notes.
You made your notes. Yeah, he's a 4chaner, so we're going to get that. I'm messing with that.
Yeah. So this person was from the South. They moved to Minnesota to go to school. They had two racist incidents. One was an elderly woman in the 1990s. So this person was born in 1910 and is dead now. And the second was actually other black people being rude to them because they were from the South.
Yeah.
And then I will also say they whined that in 1969, there were only 100 black students of 40,000 students at the U of M. But I would also like to say that in 1969, 99.7% of the population was white or indigenous, right? So they're bringing numbers up without the context that in the state of Minnesota, there were not a lot of black people around. It very well could be that 400 black students was the percentage of the population by comparison to 40,000. I don't know.
Sure.
I didn't look it up, but it might be right in line. I don't know, right? But I know that black people were not a very large percentage of the population in 1969. I know that. So, okay. The next essay.
Is that enough said about that?
Yes. It was a letter to an old friend about race.
Yes.
Would you like to begin, Nate, or would you like me to begin?
I don't know. I tried to take not a whole lot of notes on all of these because there's 36 of them, so I didn't want to go crazy. But then, I should have because I should have known that's what Mike would do. I need a bracelet that's like, what would Mike do? Anyway, this one was, I just wrote down they were talking about law enforcement treatment of blacks and minorities and then how fathers talk to their sons and children about racism and not getting help from the police. Because I tried to come into this, and you can't really do it, but, coming into this with an open mind and not coming into it as a white man, right? But I was sure I had my thoughts when I first saw it, which is why I sent a picture of it to Mike. But then he was like, hey, we should do this for the show. And I'm like, actually, this isn't a book I would normally read, but I kind of want to come into it with an open mind and a clear perspective and everything. And so, I don't know. I feel like that's how I tried to take the notes, right? If there was something egregious that kind of made me raise an eyebrow, I would write that down. Otherwise, I tried to kind of get the general sense or feel of the essay.
Sure. And I read it critically.
Yeah, and you read it critically, and I tried to be more open-minded about it. But of course, I'm going to have my perspective on it, right? Because I'm a white man. This one was I felt like it was kind of a decent what it's like to be a minority and have to have these conversations with your children about how maybe the world is, even though it shouldn't be that way.
Sure. So I took my notes. Ha ha ha. This person is a South Korean who was adopted by rich white parents in suburban Twin Cities. And they did have some good stories about growing up in the suburbs, in rich suburbia, and how they had some prejudice against them growing up, which I believe 100%.
Oh, yeah.
They followed this up with a very long story about teenagers getting yelled at by some drunks for doing dangerous things in an escalator in a skyscraper. And how they felt that the yelling wasn't because the teenagers were endangering themselves in a building, because of racism, which possibly so. And then...
probably both.
Possibly, yeah. Probably both. And then they complained about having to tell their child about how to interact with police, which I had to be told how to interact with police. I'm sure that
honestly,
the conversations
everybody should be told how to interact with police because they're not your friends.
No, the police are not your friend. They are dangerous. If you're, gonna fuck around, you're gonna find out. Like,
well, and when they tell you you have the right to remain silent, you remain silent because they will use anything you fucking say.
Yes. All right, next essay was Will Words Lead to Action? I noted that they immediately began with using coded language. They equated racial equality to ruling over white people in the United States by the BIPOC community. This person is an elite and also an immigrant. Racism in Minnesota is covert and non-physical in nature. So it's all imagined in their head. Or
that was a big theme in a lot of these essays. There's one later on that we'll talk about it, and it's probably the most blatant example of this. But
right now, this person, after saying that the racism in Minnesota is non-physical, admitted to actively looking for racism and prejudging white people to defend against their racist ways that's inherent to their whiteness. This person also defended looting and rioting during the riots after the incident of George Floyd.
I wrote that down too,
Yeah, and then said that the 220 or so black people shot in the United States a year is white supremacy.
Don't cows kill more people a year than that? Like, cows kill more people a year than sharks, I think.
Probably. I don't. Dogs probably kill more people than that a year.
I don't know. I mean, that's not to say that 220 killings is a laughable matter. I'm just, in the grand scheme of
in the grand
statistics,
scheme of 340 million people, 220 is not particularly high.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot higher than I would like it to be. I would like people killed by police to be 0.
I would like it to be 0 as well.
Except for, dare I say it, Mike, fucking Uvalde Police Department, what were you doing?
Yes. Oh, my God.
Anyway, do you want to go to the next one, Mike?
Yeah.
My Beautiful Broken Minnesota.
Yes.
This author was a little more artsy, I think, but they were talking about like art brings people together and lovey-dovey and oh my God. And then I wrote in here, and I don't really remember this one a whole lot because it was 4 months ago, but that the black students, meaning the Black American students and the actual African students, didn't get along at all. And I thought that was an interesting point to bring up.
Oh, yeah. That's a well-known anomaly, if you will.
I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying like it's here in this book. So
I noticed that this is, again, an immigrant who went to an elite college who studied gender studies. And they said that they were traumatized from hip-hop marketing, and that they were at a house party that SWAT showed up to, and they claimed it was a racial attack. And then they followed that story up with admitting that they see everything in the world through a racial lens. So they're self-admitting that their perception on purpose is to look for racial crimes.
Yeah.
So the stories they tell are self-admittedly not accurate to reality. Right? They're trying actively to create their own reality, which is a common theme we will find.
Yeah, but I guess to play devil's advocate, Mike, if they are being disparaged due to their race, would they not have to view everything through a racial lens?
Of course. But if you're somebody who is so mentally weak that you're traumatized by shitty marketing, then I cannot trust the things that you're telling me. Like, you're traumatized by a marketing campaign.
Yeah. But I want to tell you, I am traumatized by marketing. I almost don't want to watch the Super Bowl anymore, and that's the only sporting event I ever watch. Like, the commercials have gotten so bad, Mike, that I feel my whiteness is being lost with the other supremacy. I don't know what the other supremacy is, Mike. What is it? DEI supremacy. I want commercials that show me a happy white family, and I don't get that anymore. I remember Japan McDonald's put out an animated commercial that had, all same race family with a little child, and it got lambasted by the other community for being racist. And it was like, this is the most wholesome commercial anyone's seen in a long time. But yes. I don't know. I'm just a guy that smokes cigars and drinks and talks on the internet. But we're trying to be, we're not trying to put this book down necessarily. Like, that's not the goal of this episode. But when people present you with things, especially if you're reading a book that's not in your wheelhouse, which you should do, you should read books that are from differing viewpoints of your own, because maybe your viewpoint is wrong, or maybe your viewpoint is right. And I think for a large part of these essays, which, and Mike mentioned it, every single essay at the end of the essay, it tells you who the person is and what they do and where they lived or live in Minnesota. And all of these people are professors, right? They're all the PhDs or MDs, not MDs, but they've got masters, they've got doctorates, they've got a lot of higher education. So for them to be kind of lambasting about racism, like, they've achieved more than what a lot of white people in the state have achieved.
Oh yeah,
in terms of education, right? They are elites. So they're elites. And the other thing, and I wanted to mention this at the end, but I think this is going to be a 2-part episode for sure. But I also wanted to mention, all of these people are people that have achieved their professional and personal goals, and now they have the time and the resources to sit and analyze what's going on, instead of, like a majority of other people, to just try and stay above water, to try and survive, to try, to get to that next paycheck. Like, these people aren't that. These people aren't that. So they're definitely the people that have the time and the resources to sit and ponder things.
That is their main job, is to think about things and make up new complaints and then write about it, right? Publish or perish.
Well, yeah, I mean, their job is to write.
Yeah, their job
however
is
they
to
choose
write.
to do it is how they choose to do it.
Oh, none of these people they're not engineering professors, right? They're all gender studies, racial studies.
Well, yeah, they're not surgeons, right? They're not brain surgeons.
They're not mathematics
They're not
professors.
rocket scientists.
No, they're not teaching electronics at the community college.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to downplay their accomplishments in any way, shape, or form. I'm just saying that when I'm presented with the cover of this book and the subhead of George Floyd, Racism, and the Progressive Illusion, and everybody that wrote something is a college professor or master's degree holder or PhD, that's not indicative of who George Floyd was. I kind of had hoped that it would be more stories from people in George Floyd's socioeconomic circle. You know what I mean?
Right.
Not the elites. I don't need more stuff told to me from elites. I wanted more kind of on the ground, hard hitting stuff.
Yeah, this is whining by rich people.
More or less.
About perceived slights against them, which the next essay is perfect to introduce that to.
Yes. Should we do that essay and then do final thoughts on the cigar?
Yeah, we can. I still have an inch and a half or so, inch and a quarter left.
I got about an inch and a half. No, I mean, I've got the same. I don't know.
Well, I didn't have much notes for in this country.
Yeah. Well, let's do this one and the next one, and then we'll do part 2 with the next cigar.
Okay. I would like to make note.
Does that sound good to you, Mike?
Yeah. This author used coded language again, anti-racist and anti-colonial, which this person is a colonizer in the state. They're not from here. And they're an elite, so they are a colonialist. Just make note of that. But they told a story, this woman, about how she cut in line at a festival, and then some asshole, probably drunk, said, "We have rules in this country," because they got angry because she cut in line.
Yeah.
And she thought that because she's an elite colonist, that she should just be able to cut in line in front of people and have no consequences. Because again, these are rich, elite assholes who do not believe that their actions should have consequences. They could shit and piss on everyone around them because they're peasants and they're the rulers. All right. And then when anybody pushes back, it's racism.
Pretty much. I mean, you read these stories about where these people live, most of them, right? The neighborhoods in Minneapolis, St. Paul that they live. And they're not living where George Floyd was living. Let's just say that.
No, they're living in a neighborhood I couldn't afford to live in.
Yeah, 100%.
They're living where I can't live. So there we go, right? Like, these people would spit on me on the street if they had to interact with me. That's how low I am to them.
Well, and they'd be justified in doing so.
Well, probably.
Racist asshole.
Exactly.
I'm just kidding.
Do you have anything to say about In This Country?
I just wrote that they're talking about the Filipino nurses that were trained post-World War II, recruited to American hospitals, and then a lot of those nurses died on the front lines of COVID-19. But a lot of healthcare people did die on the front lines of COVID-19, and they say front lines as if it were some kind of like battle or war we were fighting. But the COVID-19 thing is its own kind of thing, but it did coincide with George Floyd because it happened during COVID-19. So there's a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of people that were deemed essential workers that unfortunately either died or had negative health, consequences of being deemed essential. But then we'll be fucked, I guess, if we ever raise minimum wage. But a lot of the minimum wage jobs were deemed essential. So I don't know how much of that has to do with race necessarily, other than rich people don't want somebody flipping burgers to make anything more than what they're currently making, I guess. So I don't know what that comes down to.
Right. Next essay.
So that's all I had to say about that one, I guess.
The sound of the sound of police.
Yeah, which is my second favorite one about noises police make.
Mm-hmm.
There's another essay that has much more to do with the sound of that, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Sound of police.
Right. So this person chose to live in a bad neighborhood, even though they're wealthy. So They are a gentrifier, which is something that this person would probably deny.
Yeah, well, of course they would.
They were mad because the police couldn't stop the drug dealing going on in their bad neighborhood.
Yeah.
And then they were mad because the police raided their house and then apologized because they said they didn't have a warrant for them. It was a previous occupant. Not that Nate would know anything about that.
Man, it's been a good couple of months now since I've had to talk to the police about the previous occupant. It wasn't even a previous occupant. You know what it was? He was a boyfriend of a previous occupant of the house. So his address has never been our house. But the police come here asking about him every couple months, every 6 months or so. And it's been about 6 months, so we're due. We're definitely due for another visit from the K-9 unit.
Yes. And so they told a story about a raid, and apparently their neighbor's pit bull was shot. And then they used flashbangs during a raid. And I just made a note that I agree that there needs to be an effective method to gain damages from illegal police raids. Or police raids that shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, and I think the whole no-knock police raid thing is finally kind of becoming illegal,
Oh, yeah. It's a bad idea, for sure.
It's not a good thing.
So during this raid of their neighbor's house, this woman felt extremely threatened, even though they did not come into her house.
Yeah.
And then she proceeded to complain simultaneously that the police weren't doing enough to stop crime, but that they were also too aggressive while trying to stop crime.
Yeah, you're not doing enough, but you're doing too much.
Right. And then, after saying the police were too aggressively trying to stop crime, but also not doing enough to stop crime, she said she wanted to end the police and not have prisons anymore. Which is that's an elite rich person thinking. Because in her world, she doesn't have to live next to the murderers and the rapists and the chomos. But she thinks that they shouldn't have to go to jail. They should be
but she chose to, based on the neighborhood she chose to live in.
She did, yeah. She did choose to live there and then left because it was dangerous, obviously. You're going to a neighborhood well known as a dangerous neighborhood. There's going to be some drug dealing.
Literally the only one in the Twin Cities that's well known. You don't even have to be from the Twin Cities to know to not live in this neighborhood.
Right. I know that. You can drive through it. And you can see that it's a bad neighborhood.
Yeah.
So,
my mom used to live there, and she would tell me stories of their neighbors just jumping their 8-foot fence into their backyard to talk to them. And I'm like, and I'm an introvert, so that sounds extra terrible to me, right? But that's not the kind of neighborhood I want to live in.
The neighborhood that they live in, there's been incidents where basically gangs have tried to block the roads to stop MnDOT vehicles, like snowplows.
Yeah.
To steal the snowplow. Like, what are you going to do with the stolen snowplow other than go to jail? Who are you going to sell it to? There's nobody who's going to buy it, but they want to steal it anyway. Like, it's insanity. Like, it's, Yeah, and then she doesn't want those people to go to jail. And also somehow for the police to solve crimes without investigating crimes.
There's no jail, but we're going to stop all the crimes. All the crimes. I put my cigar out, Mike.
Okay. I still have a little bit left. I will say that there wasn't a lot of flavor change.
No, it was starting to get a little sour towards the end.
I don't think it's that bad as far as sourness, but
it's not terrible.
No,
it's not terrible. It's not overwhelmingly anything, really. I gave it a 2.75. I don't know. I would, if somebody was like, I've just got a bunch of these, let's smoke some, I'd be like, fine, but I wouldn't go like buy one. You know what I mean?
Sure. I'm going to give it a 2 because it was very bland.
It was blandish. It was fine for most of it. The end got sour, so I don't know. 2.75 seems to be fine for me. It's like 3 is kind of the middle, so.
Right. It wasn't as good as a 3, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's not as good as a 3, for sure. I guess, this is part 1 of Sparked review. Part 2, we'll try and move along a little more through the essays. I think we'd hit 2 essays this episode. There's 36 of these fucking things.
We hit more than 2.
That's sarcasm for exaggeration, comedy, whatever.
We went through 4 pages of my notes.
Well, out of how many notes? How many pages?
Way more than 4. I have 1, 2,
probably 47. You probably took more notes than the pages they took to write the actual essays.
7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 pages of notes I took.
Okay. So 10%. You took notes equating to 10% of the actual content of the book.
That is correct. I was reading it critically.
Yes. I tried to read it, but I tried to read it from kind of a open mindset, I guess, let's say. So I wanted to give it a shot.
I was being open, but I was analyzing what they were saying. Yeah. Like, what are they really saying?
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I don't know, the Flor de Oliva Gold, if you like Connecticut's and you want something cheap, I guess, pick it up and see if you like it. I don't know that I could actually honestly recommend it. There's other Connecticut's I would recommend, but...
I don't recommend it. I just feel that there's other Connecticut's on the market that are reasonable. You
could do the Nub Connecticut. You could do the Christoph Connecticut. Almost any other Connecticut. This one is fine. It's not terrible. Not outstanding. A little less than middling. So anyway, listen next week for the exciting conclusion of Sparked and whether or not we recommend the book. Spoiler alert, we don't. But, if you want more thoughts on it, guess what? You're getting it next week. And if you don't want more thoughts on it, guess what? You're getting it next week. But we have a new cigar to smoke next week, so there'll be different opinions on that. Otherwise, thanks for listening.
Be safe, have fun. Don't live in northern Minneapolis.